Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I got an email yesterday from a gentleman. This is, "Greetings, Mr. Lehto. I have a legal question for you that might have a chance to be a subject for one of your videos. I understand that you received many emails, so if you don't have time to read further, please stop now, assuming you've taken the time to read this far, for which I thank you in advance. Sincerely," and he signed it. And then below that he wrote, "Legal question, if you have time." I had time. I wrote him back and I said, "I like your question. Do you mind if I use the question? I'll remove your name and all that, and answer it via video." And he said, "Please do. And thank you for reading my email." I said, "Hey, I try to read them all." He says, "Steve, I used to live in California. I now live out of the country. In 1991, my wife and I bought a apartment complex. Things went south in the sense the neighborhood in which we bought the property started having problems. We couldn't get renters. We also had bad renters. So we hired a property management company to take the property for us. That had more problems. We didn't get along with them. I'm summarizing here to get to the meat of the story. In late 1993, we gave up the property, worked out a deal. It went back to the bank. The property management company wasn't happy with us because," and he goes, "This is obviously a long time ago, but the agreement we had with them may have been for a specific duration of time, and because we got rid of the property, we no longer had a need for them, so they were unhappy, but we left the country and moved on. We moved out of America in 1994 and have been living abroad ever since." Now here's where it gets interesting. He puts interesting in quotes. You never want your life to get interesting when interesting is in quotes. Not that there's anything wrong with quotation marks, by the way. Quotation marks are a fine form of punctuation. He says, "I received in June or July of 1994 a letter forwarded by my brother from a court in Orange County, California. It stated that since I did not appear in court, there was a summary judgment against me, which was surprising because I had never received a request to appear in court. So I asked my brother to go to court for me and try to find out what was all going on. Turns out I'd been sued by the property management company, who said that I had been properly served to appear in court, and I hadn't showed up, therefore I lost. But the interesting thing is that my signature had been forged on the summons because I never received any such thing, in fact, was out of the country. So here are the questions. Have you ever heard of this type of thing happening? And if I wanted to fix this, how would I go about doing it?" And he says, "Of course, it's been 30 years now, but more out of curiosity." And then he says, "If you've read all of this, I have to admit I'm really impressed." And he bolded "really." Thank you. And all the best. A viewer from another continent. And this is one of the flaws in the legal system in America. And it's not that big of a flaw in that it doesn't happen so often that they're going to fix it, but it happens often enough to where I can give you examples. But there was a story out of Detroit, not 10, 15 years ago now, where one attorney's office got hired by a very, very large debt collector. And this guy was filing lawsuits against people willy-nilly, as they say. And a lot of them were filed in one particular court, a district court, and the judge noticed something, just one of these things that caught his eye. And he noticed that as this guy would come in with a stack of files to default people who didn't show up, he would always glance to see if the person had been served. And the process server can sign a thing saying, "Yes, I served this person." And he noticed that a process server had gotten lazy and had claimed to have served people all over the city on the exact same day, date, and time. And the process server might be good, but he ain't that good, because he can't be in 16 places at the same time. So the judge went and pulled files going back a little ways on this one attorney in his office and discovered that that was the case over and over and over again, where, and I believe the attorney himself may have signed some, but it's been a while since I looked at it. But what happens in a lawsuit in most states is I'm an attorney. You hire me to sue somebody else, okay? I draft the complaint based on what you tell me. I'm required to do a basic investigation to make sure that what you're telling me is correct and sounds good. And I sign the complaint as an officer of the court saying I vouch for the contents of this complaint. I ask the court to issue me a summons, which they will issue as a matter of course. They do not think about it. They literally kick it out. You walk in, you pay the filing fee, they kick out a summons. And the summons names the person who's the defendant or the defendants in the case. Each defendant would have their own summons. So you sue 3 people, you get 3 summonses. You sue 16 people, you get 16 summonses. They then hand those back to the attorney or whoever's gone to court for the attorney. Of course, a lot of this is done online now, but you get these summonses, right? The summons on it says, and I'm telling you what happens in Michigan, it says right on it, it goes, notice to the defendant. And at the top, you are named as a defendant. It goes, 1, you are being sued. It'll say 2, you must respond to this lawsuit within 21 days or 28 if served by mail. And if you do not, you may be defaulted, and you may be defaulted for everything in the complaint which is attached here too. And then it'll say, we strongly recommend you hire an attorney or take other steps, but contact the court to proceed further. And then it has the state seal and a stamp indicating that a judge or somebody official or court clerk has approved it, and it's on an approved Supreme Court approved document. And so if you get sued, a process server walks up to you and says, are you so-and-so? Boom, here you go. And they hand you a copy of the summons and the complaint. The summons tells you you're being sued. The complaint tells you what you're being sued for. Okay? Now, the summons says right on it, you are being sued. Okay, so you now are on notice that you're being sued, and you've got a certain time period within which to respond. If you turn the summons over in Michigan, on the back you'll see a thing that says return of service. And when a process server or someone who's legally allowed to serve process, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but someone who can legally serve process serves the complaint and the summons upon somebody appropriately, they then flip the summons over because they have another copy of it. And they fill out the back side and they say, and they fill in their name and they explain who they are. Because attorneys can serve process. So I've served summonses on people. Or a process server can serve a summons on somebody. So they just fill in their name and they say, if they have a title, they put it there, I'm a process server, or I'm just an individual, or I'm an attorney. And they say, I served so-and-so, and you fill in the name of the person you served on this date and time, and you put in the date and time, and then you, the process server, sign it. Now, there is often the space at the bottom of the back side of the summons called an acknowledgement of service. And if you actually find somebody who is willing to cooperate and you're not getting in a fist fight with them, and you say, hey, I'm a process server, here's a summons and complaint for you, if they're polite, the process server will say, by the way, can you sign this for me? And you can sign the thing right where it says, I'm accepting service. And there are companies out there, resident agent companies. So General Motors, for instance, if you want to sue them, you serve a resident agent. And they appoint somebody's resident agent in an office. And it's actually not General Motors' office. It's an office of a company that just does that. And they represent all kinds of corporations. If you walk into that office and say, I've got a summons and complaint for General Motors, they will look at it and go, oh, okay, it appears to be on the up and up. They'll flip it over and sign it and go, agent for General Motors. And they'll sign it, okay? So what appears to have happened to the guy who emailed me is that somebody submitted to the court a signature page going, I acknowledge service, which was a physical impossibility because this person was in Europe, thousands of miles away. So getting back to the example I gave of the rogue attorney or the legal office that was just filing all kinds of fake returns of service, it happens. But what's supposed to happen, okay, is, and I hire process servers all the time. I'll tell a process server, I need you to serve a summons and complaint on somebody. They say, okay. And I tell them, here's their address, here's what they look like, whatever. And the process server will go out and try to serve them. Well, if they go up and knock on the door, there's no one home, they can't serve them. They don't know where they work, they don't know how to find them. Where are they? So if they go back 2 or 3 times and cannot find the person, they can go to court, the attorney can, and ask for alternate service. And a court judge will usually ask and say, how'd you try to serve the person? And there are some process servers who are good at this and some who are not, but the process server will say, hey, look, I went out to the house. I went out once in a weekday during business hours. I went out one weeknight at 8 o'clock at night, and I went by on a Saturday. A judge will go, okay, well, obviously it's not because they were at work, because they wouldn't have been at work at all 3 of those times. They weren't at church all 3 of those times. They weren't, so there's something unusual going on here. And the court will usually issue an order for alternate service and say, you can serve this person by doing the following things. And it'll usually be mail them a regular copy, first class mail. Mail them a certified return receipt requested just in case they sign for it. And third, go by their house and affix the summons and complaint to the door with tape. And so they'll actually go by with a thing of packing tape, put it on the door, put a piece of tape across it, tape it to the door, mail the other two. And the thinking is that if they check their mail or they check their front door, they're going to get it. And then what happens is the court says, we'll deem that service complete when you get a receipt back indicating that the one thing got kicked back by the post office or it got signed for or whatever. But there'll be some time frame within which that would happen. So if you move to Europe and you're gone and they went to serve you and you're not there, what they're supposed to do is get an alternate service on you. Once you've been alternately served, and you'd say, but Steve, you wouldn't have been served because you're out of the country. That's a problem, okay? And so what would happen is that person could then wait 28 days or whatever the time frame is within which you have to answer the complaint and say, Your Honor, we did an alternate service on these people. They never answered. Therefore, they are in default. We want a judgment against them. The court would issue that default judgment most likely. Now, here's the problem. Most states have got court rules that govern what happens in the state courts. The federal courts have their own rules. I'm assuming this is a state court, but I don't know for sure. But if someone gets a judgment against you, okay, if you know about it, you've got a certain time frame within which to appeal it. In some states, they'll say you've got up to a year to appeal the judgment based on, you can make the argument, hey, I didn't know about it, for instance, I was never served, that kind of thing. But there does come a time where it's going to be almost impossible to overturn it simply because time has passed. But a better argument you have here is, hey, they forged my signature to that. They couldn't have gotten my signature because I'm out of the country. The bigger question, though, becomes the court is probably going to look at you and say, well, you're out of the country, obviously, so there's a problem there. But you also found out about it and didn't do anything about it. And so I don't know what the situation is in California. I'm not going to opine on that. But I can tell you that what you would need to do in real life, if you cared, is the second you discovered that someone got a judgment against you that was defective, meaning that there's a problem with it that the court might not know about, obviously, is you would want to hire an attorney and have the attorney go in and fight it and say, hey, look, they never got service in my guy. My guy was out of the country. Somebody forged a return of service, and therefore we want this judgment set aside. The problem you have then, of course, is the court might say, well, we'll set the judgment aside, but now that you're here, let's try the case. Not try it immediately, but we'll litigate the matter. And so some people are wondering, going, but Steve, if the guy stays in Europe for the rest of his life, does he need to worry about this judgment back in America? And there's an answer to that, and the answer is probably not, unless you've got assets here, or you plan on ever coming back here, or you're ever planning on having assets here, or you could have assets here. And you might say, Steve, what are the odds that somebody living in Europe who moved there in 1991 is ever going to have assets here in America? Well, when your long-lost uncle dies and has no other heirs and decides to leave his entire fortune to you, even though you're in Europe, it passes to you simply by the rules of distribution. You might have assets here. You never know. So I generally don't like the idea of leaving stuff out there unaccounted for, undealt with. But it also depends on how big the judgment is and so on. But does it surprise me that someone forged a return of service? Not really. It happens. But I can tell you that the attorney who got caught turning those into the court, I seem to recall that the court couldn't prove whether he did it himself or not, or knew about it himself or not. It may have just been a process server who did it. But I mentioned earlier that when an attorney signs a document and submits to the court, he is confirming to the court that he's reviewed the contents of the document and can vouch for the contents. So when an attorney turns in 17 returns of service for 17 different people scattered around the county, and doesn't notice that all 17 are served simultaneously, the exact moment, date, time, there's a problem there. So the attorney got suspended for a while. I believe he got his license back, but this is a problem because part of this, as you can imagine, is it's in essence the honor system. And most attorneys don't want to jeopardize their licenses by doing shady stuff like that, because that does jeopardize your license. But I think what happens instead is some process servers don't care. They get paid for service. And so when they discover somebody's skedaddled and cannot be found, you forge something, you turn it in, and you get paid. So that's most likely what happened here. But it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I would thank you by name, but I didn't ask for permission to do that, so I won't do it. But again, legal question, if you have the time. My friend, I've got all the time in the world. Questions or comments? Put them below. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. The difference between stupidity and genius is that genius has its limits.